everyone. Wow, it's been a minute, hasn't it? To all my loyal viewers who've been wondering where I disappeared to, you know how they say, better late than never? Well, I've been testing that theory pretty thoroughly. To all the new faces joining us, welcome to the channel. I'm thrilled to have you here. If you're enjoying the content and haven't subscribed yet, please hit that subscribe button. It really helps support the channel and motivates me to keep creating. Plus, it's free, which, let's be honest, is probably the only free thing left in 2024 besides unsolicited advice from relatives. Now, let's dive into today's topic. The thing about memories is how they sneak up on you. One minute you're living your life, maybe sipping coffee at your desk or watching the evening news, and the next you're right back there, heart pounding, palms sweating, every nerve screaming danger. That's how it is with me in those October nights in the Kentucky mountains. Most days I can push it down, tell myself it was all just stress and grief playing tricks on my mind. But then I'll catch a glimpse of yellow eyes in a nature documentary or hear a deep growl in some horror movie, and I'm right back there in that barn, staring into the face of something that shouldn't exist. I suppose I should start at the beginning. My name is Matt Conley, and until 2016, I was living what most would call a successful life in Lawrenceburg, Indiana. 20 years at the Argy Casino, working my way up from dealer to floor manager to operations director. Nice apartment, decent savings, the whole American dream package. But none of that mattered when I got the call about Mom. My Aunt Carol's voice on the phone that October evening was steady but strained. "Matt, honey, there's something you need to know about your mother." The words that followed: chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Advanced stage. Needs care. Hit like physical blows. My mother, the strongest person I knew, had been hiding her illness for years. Didn't want to worry me, Aunt Carol said. Typical mom, always putting everyone else first. I took emergency leave from work the next day. Packed the bag, loaded up my Ford and headed south toward the Kentucky mountains where I grew up. 5 hours of driving gave me plenty of time to wrestle with guilt. How had I not noticed during my visits home? Why hadn't I called more often? The questions chased each other around my mind as I watched the landscape change from Indiana flatlands to the rolling hills and eventually the towering peaks of eastern Kentucky. The fall colors were at their peak when I pulled into my hometown of Pine Ridge, population 987, according to the worn welcome sign. The mountains wore their autumn coat like a patchwork quilt, all blazing oranges and deep reds against the dark green of the pines. It would have been beautiful if not for the knot of dread in my stomach. Mom's house sat at the end of Miller Creek Road, the last property before the National Forest began. It was exactly as I remembered. White clapboard siding, green shutters that needed painting, the old tire swing I'd played on as a kid still hanging from the massive oak in the front yard. But something felt off. It took me a moment to realize what was missing. The excited barking of Mom's labs, Mac and Jewel. The welcome committee waiting on the porch included Aunt Carol, my cousins, and several ladies from Mom's church group. They surrounded me with hugs and casserole dishes, their familiar faces lined with worry. But it wasn't until the crowd dispersed, leaving just Aunt Carol and me on the porch, that I learned the first hint of what was really happening in Pine Ridge. "The dogs are gone, Matt," Aunt Carol said quietly, lighting a cigarette with trembling hands, "along with a lot of other animals around here. Been happening for about a year now." I frowned, watching the smoke curl up into the crisp mountain air. "Gone how? Did they run away?" She shook her head, eyes fixed on the tree line beyond the yard. Just gone. Disappeared. And they're not the only ones. That's when she told me about the missing animals' pets vanishing from fenced yards, livestock taken from locked barns, always without a trace. The local police had investigated, game wardens too, but found nothing. No bodies, no signs of ordinary predators. Your mother didn't want you to worry, Aunt Carol said. But something's wrong in these mountains, Matt. Something that ain't natural. I wanted to dismiss it as small-town paranoia, but looking at my aunt's face, this practical woman who'd never believed in anything she couldn't see with her own eyes, I felt the first cold finger of fear trace down my spine. That was just the beginning. I didn't know it then. But those missing animals were only a prelude to the horror waiting in the Kentucky darkness. A horror that would force me to question everything I thought I knew about the natural world, and about what really lurks in the shadows of those ancient mountains. That first night back home set the tone for everything that followed. Mom was asleep when I arrived, the rhythmic hiss of her oxygen machine, a constant reminder of why I had returned. I unpacked in my old bedroom, everything exactly as I'd left it years ago. High school football trophies, old Stephen Hawking books, the rifle rack my grandfather had built me. The familiar surroundings should have been comforting, but Aunt Carol's words kept echoing in my head. Around midnight, I heard Mom coughing and went to check on her. She was sitting up in bed, her thin frame racked with spasms. I helped her with the breathing treatment, pretending not to notice how her hands shook as she held the nebulizer mask. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner," she said when she could speak again. "You had your own life to worry about." "Mom, you are my life," I replied, meaning it. "I should have been here." She patted my hand, her skin paper-thin over prominent bones. "You're here now, that's what matters." I wanted to ask about the dogs then, but something in her expression stopped me. Instead, I kissed her goodnight and headed to the back porch for a cigarette, a habit I'd mostly kicked but that always returned during stress. The October night was crystal clear, stars brilliant above the mountain peaks. The porch light created a small circle of yellow illumination, beyond which the darkness seemed absolute. The woods began about 30 yards from the house, a solid wall of trees that had always marked the edge of my childhood world. I was halfway through my cigarette when I heard it. A sound that made every hair on my body stand on end. From somewhere in that impenetrable darkness came a low growl, deeper than any natural animal should be able to produce. It wasn't the sound itself that terrified me, but rather the intelligence behind it. This wasn't the mindless growl of a predator. It was a warning. The cigarette fell from my suddenly numb fingers as I scanned the tree line. Nothing moved in the darkness, but I could feel eyes on me. The sensation was so intense that I broke out in the cold sweat. Then, just at the edge of the porch light's reach, something shifted. A shadow darker than the surrounding night, massive and somehow wrong in its proportions. I caught a brief glimpse of somehow wrong in its proportions. I caught a brief glimpse of yellow eyes reflecting the light, set too high off the ground for any normal animal. I backed slowly toward the door, trying to convince myself it was just a bear. But bears don't stand 7 feet tall. Bears don't move with that terrible, purposeful grace. And bears' eyes don't follow you with calculated intelligence. Inside, I double-checked every lock, drew every curtain. Sleep was impossible. I sat in the living room with all the lights on, jumping at every creak and groan of the old house. Around 3 a.m., something moved across the front porch. Something heavy enough to make the boards groan. I heard sniffing at the door, followed by what sounded like claws scraping slowly down the wood. When dawn finally came, I went outside to check. Deep gouges marked the door from top to bottom, splintering the wood. They were too high up to be from a bear, and the pattern was all wrong, more like massive human fingers tipped with claws. Mom was already awake when I came back inside, sitting at the kitchen table with her oxygen tank beside her. One look at my face and she knew. "You saw it, didn't you?" she asked quietly. "Saw what, Mom?" So, she was silent for a long moment, staring into her coffee cup. The night Mac and Jewel disappeared, I was watching from the window. They were such good dogs. Always came right back when called. But that night, her voice broke. Something came out of the woods. Something big, walking on two legs like a man, but not a man. It had a face like a wolf, but wrong somehow. Too big to wear. It took both dogs at once, one in each hand. They were each 80 pounds, but it lifted them like they were puppies. Tears were running down her face now. I heard them yelping as it carried them into the woods. Then nothing. I called the police, but what could I tell them? That a monster took my dogs? They'd have thought I was crazy. But it's been taking other animals too. The Wilsons lost 3 cows last month. Just gone. Only blood trails leading into the woods. I sat heavily in the chair across from her. "Why didn't you tell me? What could you have done? You had your life in Indiana. I didn't want you worried about your sick old mother seeing monsters." But they weren't hallucinations. The gouges on the door proved that. And as the day wore on, I heard more stories from neighbors who stopped by to welcome me home. Everyone had lost animals. Everyone had stories of strange noises in the night, of massive shadows moving through their yards, of yellow eyes watching from the darkness. Old Jim Whitaker, who'd farmed these mountains for 60 years, pulled me aside after bringing us a pot of his wife's soup. "Something is wrong in these woods," he said, his weathered face grave. "Been hunting these mountains all my life, seen every kind of creature that lives here. But this is different. It's smart, Matt. It watches, plans, and it's getting bolder." He told me about finding one of his prize bulls dead in the pasture, not just killed but torn apart with surgical precision. Whatever did it knew exactly where to cut, like it was harvesting organs. And the strength it would take to do that to a full-grown bull. That night, I cleaned my old hunting rifles and loaded them with the heaviest ammunition I had. I told myself it was just precaution, that there had to be a rational explanation. But deep down, I knew better. Something was hunting in these mountains, something that didn't belong in any sane world. As I sat cleaning my grandfather's old 36, Mom watched from her chair, oxygen mask fogging with each labored breath. "Be careful, Matt," she said softly. "It's not like any animal you've ever hunted. It knows things, watches, learns." I wanted to tell her she was wrong, that we were all letting fear and isolation play tricks on our minds. But then I remembered those yellow eyes watching me from the darkness, that terrible, intelligent growl, and I knew we were dealing with something beyond normal understanding. What I didn't know then was that the creature was watching us at that very moment, learning our patterns, our weaknesses, and it was getting hungry again. The next few days fell into a routine. I'd help Mom with her breathing treatments, make sure she ate, handle the household chores she could no longer manage. But underneath the domestic rhythm was a constant tension. Every noise from the woods made us jump. Every shadow at dusk could be hiding something unnatural. The creature didn't show itself during daylight, but evidence of its presence was everywhere once I knew what to look for. massive tracks in the soft earth behind the house, too big for any known predator and shaped all wrong, like a twisted combination of wolf and human prints. Claw marks on trees 10 feet off the ground. And the silence. No bird song, no squirrels chattering, none of the normal sounds of mountain wildlife. Everything that could flee had already gone. It was on my 4th night home that things escalated. Mom had finally fallen asleep after a particularly bad coughing spell, and I was dozing in the armchair beside her bed when a sound jolted me awake. The terrible splintering crack of wood being torn apart. I grabbed the rifle I'd taken to keeping nearby and ran to the back door. The rabbit hutch Mom kept in the yard, a sturdy structure I'd built myself from pressure-treated lumber and heavy-gauged wire, had been completely destroyed. But it wasn't the destruction that made my blood run cold. It was the methodical nature of it. The wire hadn't been torn randomly, but carefully peeled back in precise strips. The wooden supports weren't simply broken, but dismantled with almost surgical precision. And the rabbits, God, the rabbits. Their bodies weren't ravaged like normal predator kills. They'd been systematically dissected, organs laid out in neat rows on the grass like some grotesque display. As I stood there trying to process what I was seeing, I heard movement in the woods. Something large was moving through the trees, just beyond the reach of the security lights I'd installed. Then came that growl again, that deep, resonant sound that seemed to vibrate in your bones. But this time it was followed by something worse. Laughter. Not human laughter, but a terrible approximation of it, like something that had learned the sound but didn't quite understand its meaning. I raised the rifle, hands shaking. "Show yourself," I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. The laughter stopped. For a moment, complete silence fell over the yard. Then, at the edge of the light, something emerged from the trees. It came forward slowly, deliberately, walking upright on 2 legs like a man. But that's where any resemblance to humanity ended. It stood at least 7 feet tall, its body a grotesque fusion of wolf and human characteristics. The head was lupin, but too large, too intelligent, with yellow eyes that gleamed with unmistakable awareness. Its arms were too long, ending in massive hands with elongated fingers tipped with curved claws. Dark fur covered its body, but not uniformly. Patches of scarred skin showed through in places, as if it was caught between forms. But it was the face that haunted me most. Those eyes. They weren't animal eyes. They held knowledge, calculation, cruel intelligence. The creature's muzzle pulled back in what might have been a smile, revealing rows of gleaming teeth that would put a great white shark to shame. I fired. The shot echoed off the mountains, and the creature jerked as the bullet struck it in the shoulder. But instead of falling, it just looked down at the wound with what seemed like curiosity. Then, those terrible eyes fixed on me again, and I swear, it smiled wider. It moved faster than anything that size had any right to move. One moment it was 30 yards away, the next it was almost on top of me. I fired again, but in my panic the shot went wide. I had time to see those massive claws reaching for me before survival instinct kicked in, and I dove back through the door, slamming it shut. The door shuddered in its frame as something massive slammed against it. I heard wood splintering, saw those claws punching through like the door was made of cardboard. But then another sound cut through the chaos. Mom's oxygen machine alarm beeping frantically from her bedroom. The attack on the door stopped instantly. Through the holes I saw those yellow eyes studying me for a moment, Then the creature turned and loped back into the darkness, moving with that terrible, fluid grace. I ran to Mom's room and found her gasping for breath, the oxygen tube having come loose in her sleep. As I helped her with the breathing treatment, my hands still shaking from the encounter, a horrible realization hit me. The creature had stopped its attack when it heard Mom's distress. It had made a conscious choice to withdraw. This wasn't just some animal acting on instinct. This thing was thinking, planning, maybe even playing with us. And somehow, that was more terrifying than any mindless beast could ever be. The next morning, I called old Jim Whitaker. If anyone would know more about what we were dealing with, it would be him. He arrived an hour later in his battered pickup truck, carrying a leather-bound book that looked ancient. "My grandfather's journal," he explained as we sat on the porch, both of us watching the tree line like we expected the creature to emerge at any moment. He wrote about something similar back in 1943, animals disappearing, strange tracks, a creature that walked like a man but wasn't one. He opened the journal carefully, its pages yellow with age. Inside were detailed drawings that made my skin crawl, sketches of a creature that matched what I'd seen, along with notes about its behavior and habits. "According to this, it shows up every few decades," Jim continued. "Always in October, always when the hunting's good. But this time it's different. It's staying longer, getting bolder, and I think," he paused, looking uncomfortable, "I think it's getting smarter." He showed me more recent newspaper clippings he'd collected. Livestock mutilations, missing pets, even a few missing hikers over the years, all dismissed as animal attacks or misadventure. But looking at the patterns, a chilling picture emerged. The creature was methodical, learning, evolving its hunting strategies. "Your grandfather," I asked, "did he ever figure out what it was?" Jim shook his head. He had theories. Said it wasn't natural, wasn't something that belonged in God's creation, called it a skinwalker in some entries, a wendigo in others. But names don't matter much when you're dealing with something like this. What matters is stopping it. He pulled out a map of the area and spread it on the porch railing. "I've been tracking its movements. There's a pattern. It's using the old mine tunnels in the mountain, moving between them to cover more territory. But it always returns to this area." He pointed to a spot about 2 miles from my mother's house. "Why there?" "There's an abandoned coal shaft that goes deep into the mountain, been sealed up since the 60s, but something's cleared away the barriers. I think that's its lair." He looked at me seriously. "I've got a plan, but I need help. Someone who knows these woods and can handle themselves in a fight. Someone who's seen what we're dealing with and won't freeze up when the time comes." I knew what he was asking. Every rational part of my brain was screaming to say no, to pack up Mom and get her somewhere safe, somewhere far from these haunted mountains. But I thought about those yellow eyes watching us, about the methodical way it had laid out those rabbit organs, about how it was learning and getting bolder. Running wouldn't solve anything. It would just leave others to face this horror. "What's the plan?" I asked. Jim's plan was simple in theory, though the execution would prove far more challenging and ultimately more horrifying than either of us could have imagined. We would set a trap in his barn, using livestock as bait. The structure was solid, built in the 1950s with heavy timber and steel reinforcements, with only 2 main entrances we need to watch. The hayloft offered clear sight lines and multiple firing positions. Most importantly, it was far enough from any homes that we wouldn't risk civilian casualties if things went wrong. We spent the next 2 days preparing. Jim had an impressive arsenal, everything from traditional hunting rifles to military-grade weapons he'd acquired through channels he wouldn't discuss. We chose our loadout carefully. Winchester Magnums with custom loads, backup 12-gauge shotguns with solid slugs, and 44 Magnum revolvers as last resort. We also set up emergency lighting, motion sensors, and even some primitive tripwires. The hardest part was explaining to Mom why I wouldn't be home that night. She knew, of course. Mothers always know. As I checked my weapons one last time, she grabbed my hand with surprising strength. "It knows you're hunting it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not just an animal, Matt. It understands everything we do, maybe even everything we say." "Be careful." I kissed her forehead, trying to ignore how cold her skin felt. "I'll be back in the morning," I promised. "Aunt Carol will stay with you tonight." The sun was setting as Jim and I took our positions in the hayloft. We had a clear view of both the main entrance and the smaller side door, with powerful floodlights ready to illuminate the entire interior. 2 young calves were tethered below us, bait that Jim assured me would be irresistible to the creature. The wait was excruciating. Hours passed in tense silence as darkness settled over the mountains. Every creak of the barn's timbers, every rustle of wind through the gaps in the walls sent adrenaline surging through my system. Around midnight, the calves began showing signs of distress, moving restlessly and making soft, distressed sounds. "It's coming," Jim whispered, raising his rifle. The motion sensors went off first, not at either entrance, but somehow on all sides simultaneously. Then came that familiar growl, but this time it seemed to come from everywhere at once, as if we were surrounded. The calves were panicking now, straining at their ropes. Something's wrong," I started to say, but then all hell broke loose. The creature didn't come through either door. It burst through the roof above us, showering us with splintered wood and shingles. In the chaos, I caught glimpses of it that my mind still struggles to process. It seemed larger than before, its proportions all wrong, as if it was still changing, still evolving. Those yellow eyes blazed with intelligence and something else, amusement. We opened fire, the sound deafening in the confined space. I know we hit it. I saw blood spraying from multiple impacts, but it didn't seem to care. It moved with impossible speed, first on 2 legs, then on 4, then somehow in between, as if its body could reshape itself at will. Jim screamed. I turned to see him lifted bodily from the hayloft. Massive claws sunk deep into his shoulders. The creature held him up to its face, those terrible eyes studying him like a scientist examining a specimen. Then, with deliberate slowness, it began to pull. What happened next will haunt me until the day I die. The creature didn't simply tear Jim apart. It dissected him, methodically separating muscle from bone, organs from tissue, all while he was still conscious. It was studying human anatomy, learning through direct examination, and all the while those eyes kept darting to me, making sure I was watching, learning this lesson in terror. I emptied my rifle into it, then the shotgun, then my revolver. The bullets hurt it. I could see that, but they didn't stop it. If anything, they seemed to make it more excited, more determined to continue its grotesque demonstration. When it finally finished with Jim, it turned those eyes on me. But instead of attacking, it did something worse. It spoke. "Thank you for the lesson," it said in a voice that was almost human, but utterly wrong, like someone learning speech by dissecting vocal cords. "So much to learn. So much to become." Then it was gone, moving faster than my eyes could track, leaving me alone in the blood-soaked barn with what remained of Jim Whitaker. I don't remember much about the next few hours. The police came. Asked questions I couldn't answer truthfully. How could I tell them that a creature that shouldn't exist had killed Jim as part of some twisted anatomy lesson? They blamed it on a bear attack, just like they'd blamed all the other incidents. It was easier that way, safer. But as I drove home in the pre-dawn light, my clothes still stained with Jim's blood, I realized something that chilled me even more than the night's horror. The creature hadn't killed me because it wasn't finished learning. I was part of its study, just like the rabbits had been, just like Jim had been. It was watching, learning, evolving. And somehow, I knew it wasn't just about understanding anatomy anymore. It wanted to understand us, our fears, our reactions, our capacity for terror. Mom was waiting up when I got home, one look at my face telling her everything she needed to know. As I broke down and told her everything, she held me like she had when I was a child, when the darkness was just darkness and monsters weren't real. "It's getting stronger," she said finally, "more intelligent. Each time it comes back to these mountains, it learns more, becomes more. Your grandfather's generation drove it away, but it came back. Jim's father's generation did the same. Now it's our turn." "How do we stop something that bullets can't kill?" I asked. She was quiet for a long moment, her breathing labored even with the oxygen. "Maybe that's not the question we should be asking," she said, finally. "Maybe we need to understand what it wants, why it's here, why it's learning, what it's trying to become." But understanding meant getting closer to it, studying it as it studied us. And after what I'd seen in that barn, I wasn't sure my sanity could take much more understanding. Yet I knew we had no choice. The creature wasn't going to stop. If anything, Jim's death would only encourage it to escalate its lessons. That night, as I cleaned my weapons and made plans, I could feel it watching from the darkness beyond our windows. Those yellow eyes seemed to glow brighter now, filled with an intelligence that was growing by the day. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I could have sworn I heard that terrible, almost human voice. So much to learn, so much to become. The war for survival in those Kentucky mountains was just beginning, and I was starting to realize that bullets and bravery might not be enough to win it. The next week brought changes, both in the creature's behavior and in my understanding of what we were facing. I spent my days caring for Mom, whose condition was deteriorating faster than anyone had expected, and my nights researching everything I could find about similar incidents throughout the region's history. The local library yielded surprising results. Once I knew what to look for, patterns emerged in yellowed newspaper clippings and local histories. Every few decades, the same sequence of events. Missing animals, mysterious tracks, unexplained deaths blamed on natural causes. But each time the creature returned, the incidents became more sophisticated, more calculated. In the 1940s, it had been simple animal mutilations. By the 1960s, it was conducting crude dissections. Now it was performing complex anatomical studies. It was learning, evolving, but toward what end? Mom's friend Sarah, who worked at the County Historical Society, provided another crucial piece of the puzzle. She brought over a collection of Native American accounts from the early settlement days. The Cherokee had known about the creature, called it by a name that translated roughly to the one who changes. Their stories described it not as a simple monster, but as something that came from the stars, something that had been studying Earth's creatures for countless generations, learning to become them. This revelation hit me hard. We weren't dealing with a supernatural beast or a cryptid. This was something older, something that perhaps wasn't even from our world. The implications were staggering, but theoretical concerns took a back seat to immediate threats. The creature's activities were escalating. 3 more farms reported livestock mutilations, each more precise and systematic than the last. A hiker disappeared on the mountain, only to be found 2 days later, arranged like an anatomical display, organs carefully separated and laid out as if for study. The official report blamed bears again, but I knew better. The creature was conducting experiments, learning about human biology piece by piece. Then came the night that changed everything. Mom had been having a particularly bad day, her breathing more labored than usual. I was dozing in the chair beside her bed when I heard it, that now familiar growl, but closer than ever before, right outside her window. I grabbed my rifle and ran to the window. The creature was there, standing fully upright in the moonlight, its form somehow more defined than before, more purposeful. Those yellow eyes locked onto mine, and then it did something new. It raised one massive clawed hand and beckoned to me. It wanted me to come outside. To what end, I couldn't imagine, but I knew what refusing wasn't an option. This thing had been toying with us, learning about us, and now it wanted, what? Communication? Understanding? Don't, Mom whispered from her bed, but we both knew I had no choice. I stepped out onto the back porch, rifle ready but not raised. The creature stood at the edge of the woods, its form shifting slightly in the darkness, as if it couldn't quite decide which shape to hold. Up close, I could see how its anatomy had changed since our first encounter. It seemed more refined now, its features more deliberately constructed, as if it was perfecting its form through each transformation. Why? I found myself asking, why are you doing this? It tilted its head, an unsettlingly human gesture. When it spoke, its voice was clearer than before, though still wrong in ways I can't quite describe. To become, it said, to understand, to evolve. By killing? By dissecting. How else to learn what you are? It moved closer, its movement liquid smooth. Your kind learns through destruction, through taking things apart to see how they work. I am no different. We're not your science experiment, I said, finger tightening on the trigger. It made that terrible laughing sound again. You already are. You always have been, since before your kind built cities, before you made tools. We have been watching, learning, becoming. We? The word sent a chill down my spine. Others, many others, studying, learning, all becoming. It gestured at its own form. This shape, useful for now, but not final. Never final. Always more to learn. Always more to become. The implications hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just one creature. There were others out there, studying, learning, evolving. How many missing persons cases, how many unexplained incidents throughout history had been their lessons? Then it said something that froze my blood. Your mother. Her illness. Fascinating process. Watching organs fail. Learning how your kind dies. Rage exploded through me. I raised the rifle and fired, emptying the magazine into its chest. The creature staggered back, black blood oozing from multiple wounds, but it didn't fall. Instead, it seemed to absorb the damage, its flesh rippling and reforming around the injuries. Good, it said, sounding almost pleased. Strong emotions, complex chemical reactions, much to learn. It moved faster than I could track, closing the distance between us in an instant. One massive hand wrapped around my throat, lifting me off the ground, but it didn't squeeze. Instead, it studied my face with those terrible, intelligent eyes. Your kind fears death, it said. Fears pain, fears the unknown. Why? Need to understand, need to learn. Through my terror, a horrible realization dawned. It wasn't just studying our biology. It was studying our emotions, our responses to fear and pain. Each act of violence, each cruel display was an experiment in human psychology. Then Mom's voice rang out from behind me. "Let him go." She was standing in the doorway, oxygen tank beside her, holding my backup shotgun with shaking hands. The creature's eyes fixed on her with terrible interest. Terminal illness, respiratory failure. Yet you stand, you fight. Why? "Because that's what humans do," she said, and pulled the trigger. The blast caught the creature in the face, causing it to drop me. I rolled away, grabbing my fallen rifle. Mom fired again and again, each shot driving the creature back. But it wasn't really hurt. If anything, it seemed fascinated by her resistance. "More to learn?" it said, its face already regenerating. "Much more. We'll return. We'll understand. We'll become." Then it was gone, melting into the darkness with that impossible speed. I ran to Mom, who had collapsed, her breathing dangerously shallow. As I helped her back inside and got her breathing stabilized, she gripped my hand. "It's not just studying us," she gasped. "It's trying to become us, not just our bodies, our emotions, our will to survive. That's what it really wants to understand." She was right, I realized. The creature wasn't just learning about human anatomy. It was trying to understand what made us human on a deeper level. Our fears, our loves, our determination to protect those we care about. Each act of violence was an experiment in human nature. And somehow, that was more terrifying than any simple monster could ever be. The next few days passed in a blur of tension and preparation. I fortified the house as best I could, though I knew conventional defenses meant little against something that could tear through walls like paper. Mom's condition worsened, whether from the stress of her encounter or the natural progression of her disease, I couldn't tell. The sound of her coughing echoed through the house at night, mixing with the creature's distant growls in a terrible symphony. I wasn't the only one who'd seen it now. Reports flooded the local police station. Sightings of something impossible moving through yards at night, studying houses from the tree line, even pressing its face against windows to watch families eating dinner. It was learning our habits, our daily routines, our social interactions. The breaking point came when Kevin Marshall's kid disappeared. Kevin was the local veterinarian, and his 17-year-old son Tyler had been taking night classes at the community college. One evening, Tyler's car was found abandoned on Mountain View Road, the driver's door open, books scattered across the asphalt. They found him 3 days later, or what was left of him. The body was arranged in the middle of the high school football field like some grotesque teaching aid. Not just dissected, but modified. Limbs had been repositioned, muscles reattached, in new configurations, as if the creature had been experimenting with improved human design. But the worst part was Tyler's face, frozen in an expression not of terror, but of clinical interest, as if even in death he was part of the creature's endless study of human nature. I was there when they found him. The official story would blame wild animals again, but everyone who saw the body knew better. This was something new. The creature wasn't just learning anymore. It was starting to experiment, to modify, to try creating something new from what it learned. That night, I sat with Mom in her room, both of us armed, both knowing something had to be done. "It's not going to stop," she said between labored breaths. "Each time it comes back, it learns more, becomes more, and now it's trying to improve us, to remake us in whatever image it thinks is better." "How do you fight something that can't be killed?" I asked, more to myself than her. She was quiet for a long moment, the oxygen machine hissing in the darkness. "Maybe," she said finally, "you don't try to kill it. Maybe you try to understand it first. Understand it? Mom, it's dissecting people like lab specimens. Yes, because that's how it learns. It's studying us, the way we study things, by taking them apart, seeing how they work. But there are other ways to learn, to understand. She started coughing then, harsh, racking spasms that seemed to tear at her chest. When she could speak again, her voice was weaker. It's fascinated by how we deal with death, with loss. Maybe that's the key. Before I could ask what she meant, we heard it, that distinctive growl, closer than ever before. But this time it was followed by words, coming from just outside her window. The dying one. Wanna watch, wanna understand. I raised my rifle, but Mom grabbed my arm. No, she said. Let it come. Mom, no. Trust me, she whispered. The window exploded inward as the creature forced its massive frame through the opening. It seemed different again. Its form more refined, more purposeful. Those yellow eyes blazing with terrible intelligence. It looked at my rifle, then dismissed it, focusing entirely on Mom. Terminal illness, it said, moving closer. Cellular degradation, organ failure. But still you fight, still you protect. Why? Because that's what love is, Mom said, her voice steady despite her weakness. Something you can't learn by taking us apart. The creature tilted its head, studying her. Love. Complex chemical reactions in brain. Have studied in previous subjects, but incomplete understanding. Show me. I'll show you, Mom said. Into my horror, she held out her hand to the creature. Mom, don't. But she gave me that look. The one that had stopped arguments since I was a kid. And I fell silent. The creature reached out one massive clawed hand, surprisingly gentle, as it took her fragile fingers in its grip. The contrast was stark, her pale, thin hand engulfed by its dark, powerful one. Feel that? Mom asked. That's fear. I'm terrified right now. But I'm still here, still trying to understand you. Because that's what humans do. We try to understand, to connect, even when we're afraid, even when we're dying. The creature's eyes narrowed. Why? Inefficient, dangerous. Because that's how we learn, not just by taking things apart, but by putting them together, by connecting, by loving even when it hurts. To my amazement, the creature seemed to be listening. Really listening. Its form shifted slightly, becoming somehow less threatening, more curious. Show more, it said. What followed was the strangest night of my life. For hours, Mom talked to the creature about love, about family, about what it really means to be human. She showed it old photos, told it stories about raising me, about losing her own parents, about all the joy and pain that makes up a human life. And it listened. Really listened. Sometimes it asked questions, its voice becoming more natural, more understanding. Its form continued to shift subtly, becoming less monstrous, more something else. Something neither human nor animal, but something trying to understand both. As dawn approached, Mom's strength was fading. The creature noticed, its head tilting in that now familiar gesture of curiosity. You are dying, it said. Soon. But not afraid? I'm terrified, Mom admitted, but I'm also at peace, because I know my son will remember me, will carry my love with him. That's how humans achieve immortality. Not through perfect bodies or endless life, but through the connections we make, the love we leave behind. The creature was silent for a long moment. Then it said something that chilled me to my core, beginning to understand. Not just biology, not just fear. Something more. Need time. Need to learn differently now. It turned those terrible yellow eyes to me. Will return. Not to hunt. To learn. To understand. Love. Then it was gone, moving through the broken window with that impossible grace, leaving us alone in the pre-dawn darkness. Mom died 3 days later, peacefully in her sleep, holding my hand. At her funeral, I swear I saw something watching from the tree line. Something with yellow eyes that now held not just intelligence, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. That was 5 years ago. I still live in Indiana, working a desk job that keeps me safely surrounded by concrete and steel. But I keep tabs on my hometown, monitoring police reports and local news for any sign of the creature's return. There have been sightings, but they're different now. Instead of mutilated animals and dissected bodies, people report glimpses of something watching from the woods. Something that seems more curious than threatening. Hikers tell stories of being followed by something that never quite reveals itself, but leaves small gifts. Arranged flowers, intricate patterns of stones, once even a crude drawing that seemed to depict a human family. Last month, I received a package from Pine Ridge. Inside was Mom's old photo album, which had gone missing after her funeral. The pages were handled carefully, almost reverently, though the corners showed marks from inhuman fingers. A note was tucked inside, written in strange, spidery handwriting. Beginning to understand. Love changes form, like I change form, continues after death, like energy cannot be destroyed. Still learning, still becoming, but differently now. Thank you for this lesson. I keep the note locked in my desk drawer, taking it out sometimes when I need to remind myself that it wasn't all a grief-induced hallucination. The creature was real, is real, and somehow my dying mother taught it something that all its centuries of biological study couldn't reveal. The true nature of humanity. But I still keep my rifles cleaned and loaded. Still check the tree line when I visit Mom's grave. Because while the creature may be learning about love, it's still learning about everything else that makes us human. Our capacity for violence, our ability to hate, our talent for destruction. And I wonder sometimes what it will become when it finally understands all of us, both our light and our darkness. Last week, I found another note on my doorstep in Indiana, over 200 miles from Pine Ridge. Others coming, more to learn, more to become. Some understand love now. Others still learn through pain. Must be ready. Must help them understand better way. So I keep watching, keep waiting. And I remember Mom's last coherent words to me. Sometimes the monsters aren't what we need to fear. Sometimes it's our unwillingness to understand them that's truly dangerous. I don't know if the creature that killed Jim Whitaker and dissected Tyler Marshall can ever truly understand human love. I don't know if its kind will choose Mom's way of learning or continue their brutal studies. But I do know that something changed in those Kentucky mountains, something that might determine the future of both our species. So if you are ever in the Appalachians and feel eyes watching you from the darkness, if you hear that distinctive growl or catch a glimpse of yellow eyes studying you from the tree line, remember this. They're learning, always learning, and what they become might depend on what we choose to teach them. As for me, I keep Mom's photo album by my bed, and sometimes at night, I could swear I hear that almost human voice whispering from the shadows, "Still learning, still becoming, still remembering the dying one who taught love. And maybe that's the real horror. Not that monsters exist, but that they can learn to be something else entirely. Huh? Something that might be better than us, or far, far worse. The choice, perhaps, is ours.